You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking with Steve Hearns on the performance pizza. So what I wanted to do is just examine the concept of the performance pizza with Steve. So this is a concept which examines three main domains of performance within pre-hospital care. So the predictable routine, the predictable emergencies, and then the unpredictable emergencies. So what I want to do is dig into each of these domains and examine what each constitutes and how you train for each state and how to navigate each state. So to do this, I have Steve Hearns with me. Stephen is a consultant in emergency and aeromedical retrieval medicine. He works with Scotland's Emergency Medical Retrieval Service, providing aeromedical retrieval and critical care services for major trauma patients, acute medical patients, and indeed rural hospital secondary retrievals, as well as major incident responses. So Steve was inspired by experience he gained within London's Air Ambulance and indeed Queensland Australia. So it led to Steve establishing the EMRS system from a group of small volunteers within 2004 to what is now a fully funded government organisation which practices 24/7 aeromedical retrieval services. So welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Oh, listen, thanks very much for having me, and it's good to speak to you again. It's a long time since we've spoken, so really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Steve, I just wonder if we could start by looking at the performance pizza that you've articulated. Could you maybe speak to these three domains that you've seen from practice and how they interlock and interact?
Yeah, so this is a model that I've been thinking about for a number of years, and what it's about is thinking about how we approach decisions and practical tasks when we're at a pre-hospital scene. And what I want to do maybe later on is link that to how we make decisions, how our long-term memory works, and how we train for high-pressure, high-performance situations. But the idea of the performance pizza is it's a pre-hospital scene is like a circle, like a pizza. And the way I see it is that the decisions and the practical tasks can be divided up into three parts. There is predictable routine, there are predictable emergencies, and then there are unpredictable emergencies. So the predictable routine things are things that we do at almost every scene, and by definition are quite routine. That might be assessing some safety, it might be carrying out a primary survey, even carrying out an emergency anaesthetic, giving a blood transfusion, putting a splint on, things that we know that we are going to do on a regular basis at these scenes. Then there are predictable emergencies, and those are things that we don't want to go wrong, but that we can anticipate, that we or our colleagues have had previous experience of, and that we can actually plan for and train for. And then there are unpredictable emergencies, things that everyone that's been involved in pre-hospital care has experienced, that thing that you just couldn't train for, you couldn't anticipate, that just broadsides you and requires a bit of ducking and diving to overcome. So performance pizza, three big slices, predictable routine, predictable emergencies, and then the unpredictable emergencies.
Steve, let's just look at the predictable emergencies, the predictable routine first. Let's just look at when tasks are routine and reoccurring tasks and decisions in daily life. So you say these require systems and training to allow sort of fast, automatic, almost unconscious cognition. And this sort of frees up capacity for nuanced elements requiring almost analytical cognition. Could you maybe speak to that and just unpack the predictable routine a little bit more?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is kind of rock the boat a wee bit about how we train and prepare for these any high pressure situations. And again, we'll probably come back to it a bit later on. It's definitely simulation has got its place, but I would argue that lots of teams and organizations focus a bit too much on simulation. What I think that we need to do to prepare ourselves and our teams optimally for high pressure situations is have a think about how we make decisions under pressure, very much be aware of our limited cognitive capacity, and also whereabouts in our long-term memories we store information and the ability to carry out technical tasks. Now, what I'm getting at there is that the main barrier to us being able to perform well in a high pressure situation is our limited cognitive capacity. And that's related to how we've evolved. And our cognitive capacity is really down to our limited working memory. So when we are at that complex road traffic collision, that complex case of interpersonal violence, what we are doing is using that short-term working memory to pull in information that we've learned from our long-term memory, to take on information that's coming to you from the scene, from the patient, from monitors, and consider options and make decisions. But unfortunately, the size of that working memory, that cognitive capacity, is really limited. So what we have to do is try and preserve capacity there and also use that limited cognitive capacity as efficiently as possible. And one way that we could do that is by being aware that there are two ways of making decisions and judgments, and also two ways of carrying out practical tasks. As you described there, there's automatic cognition and there's analytical cognition. Now, analytical cognition is when we are consciously and rationally taking on board information, considering options and choosing the right option when we're making a judgment or a decision, or if we're carrying out a practical task, like say, putting on a femoral traction splint. If we're using analytical cognition, we're thinking, oh, where does that strap go? Does this part connect into that? Whereabouts do I put the loop for the foot? And that analytical cognition is actually, unfortunately, really pretty slow, and it's really demanding of that limited cognitive capacity. But there's another way of making decisions and carrying out practical tasks, and that is called automatic cognition or intuitive decision making. And that is based on pattern recognition. If we've come across that situation multiple times previously, or if we've drilled putting on that splint, then we don't require that slow, demanding analytical cognition. We can do it with automatic cognition, and that's really fast, and it doesn't use up a lot of that limited cognitive capacity. So what I'm getting at here is that, particularly for the predictable routine tasks, if we've trained in a way that allows us to use that automatic cognition, it frees up our cognitive capacity for the nuanced aspects of the job that do require the analytical cognition.
Steve, how do we train to get better at this sort of predictable routine in practice? Because, like you said, there probably is quite a lot of these circumstances we're running through our day, and using more subconscious decision making, pattern recognition, and it probably occupies a lot of our kind of day-to-day routine, predictable emergency care, really. How do we get better at this state, and indeed maybe even train our subconscious decision making even to an even finer point?
So I think it lends itself best to practical tasks. And I think there are 4 or 5 steps that, as a team or organization, an individual, we need to do. So we need to identify which tasks are in that category of predictable routine, and actually probably physically make a list of those. The next step is to standardize how your team undertake that practical task, so that there's a sort of set piece way that you do it. Then you train people, or you learn how to undertake the task. But the key bit is that you repeatedly drill it. You do it again and again and again until it goes into a part of your long-term memory called your procedural memory, and it starts to become intuitive. So that's what we do. The best analogy for this that I can think of is learning to drive. So my kids learn to drive, so they're in the car initially, and they're having to use that demanding, slow analytical cognition for everything, thinking about where their hands are on the steering wheel, thinking about the speed that they're driving, what gear they're in, where they are on the road, and they've got no spare cognitive capacity to listen to the radio, to listen to one of your podcasts, to have a conversation with anybody else. A year later, they're driving that car and they're not thinking at all about what gear they're in. They're intuitively recognizing the noise of the engine. They're subconsciously aware of the speed of the other vehicles, etc. So they've transformed all of the decisions, the judgments, the practical tasks that need to be carried out from demanding slow analytical cognition to automatic cognition. And a year later, they can have a conversation with you if you were sitting in the passenger seat. And that is what we need to do in high performance pre-hospital care, is as many of those predictable routines, and identify what they are, standardize how you undertake them, and then repeatedly drill them.
Really interesting you say that, actually, because like you said, I think driving is an excellent example, because you can get to work after driving for 20 years and be it an hour, 2 hours, and think, actually, for the last hour, you've put no mental cognitive power into driving, because like you said, it's such deeply motoric, rehearsed skill, which takes residual attention, doesn't take focal central attention, and actually is probably an energy saving evolutionary tool to know then you can focus your attention on other things. And it seems to be, like you said, within clinical practice, that there can be, it can be the same within clinical practice, and we can train to use that element of cognition. But shifting pace slightly, Steve, and looking at predictable emergencies. And so, within your predictable emergencies piece, you say, we look at tasks and decisions which have recognized complications, that these require sort of pre-planned, standardized, step-by-step approaches to minimize time to act, reduce error, and minimize the need for demanding analytical decision-making. So there's a little bit more, it sounds like there's more attention creeping into these, and you have to be a little bit more purposefully analytical, purposefully communicative with the team. Could you maybe unpack predictable emergencies a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. So predictable emergencies are things that are going to go wrong with your patient, or with the scene that you can potentially anticipate, or yourself or other members of your team have previously experienced. So that might be a failed intubation. It might be the development of a tension pneumothorax once you start positive pressure ventilation. It might be the patient's blood pressure collapsing on induction of emergency anesthesia. It might be, the patient, the trapped, crushed patient that, has a cardiovascular collapse once they're released. So it is a whole range of things that could potentially go wrong, or deteriorations that can occur in the pre-hospital environment. And what we don't want to be doing is trying to problem solve and react to that using basic first principles, and definitely not using that slow analytical cognition if we can avoid it. Again, so what we want to do is we want to plan how we are going to react to that, and have a pre-planned response, whether that's an emergency action card, or again, some procedures that have been drilled, and indeed have keywords within your team that you can immediately create a shared mental model of what's happening. So as medics, what do we do? So we've got a problem with a patient's ventilation, and we will go over and we'll start adjusting the ventilator. We'll try, does this work? Does that work? And we will become quite task fixated on that. The same situation occurring in an aircraft is approached completely differently. So in a helicopter or plane, there will be dozens, even 100 different types of emergency that the aircraft manufacturers have encountered or can anticipate, whether it's a battery failure or a piece of equipment overheating. And what they have got is that whenever the pilot is alerted to that, he or she will get out what they call a caption card. And that will be a pre-programmed response to that predictable emergency. And it will have a set sequence of actions. And the first ones will be to make sure that the aircraft is as safe as possible, stays in the air, that the full crew are aware of what's happening. And then you start to troubleshoot. And what they do is they identify what those predictable emergencies are, and they test out those solutions to those problems in a simulator, or indeed actually in flight with test pilots. And that's something that if we zoom out in medicine and try to learn from other high performance professionals, that's something that we should probably embrace, but we don't. We're maybe a bit arrogant about our abilities to problem solve in high pressure situations, and probably overestimate our ability to do that. So actually create, number one is drilling those, because for some of those emergencies, it should be an intuitive automatic response, but also they should be supported by emergency action cards, where we've actually gone into the simulator, we've simulated that problem, and we've got a set piece response to it.
And Steve, looking at, so absolutely, you speak to these emergency action drills. So there's almost a formulaic checklist. You can just really start to offload the bandwidth, because, as you said before, the mental bucket fills quite quickly, and it's not long before overwhelm, or the feeling of overwhelm, can set in. Could you maybe speak to how we practice this indeed either in simulation or in training, to sort of to instigate these emergency action drills? Do we sort of declare the emergency and indeed run through these emergency action drills in practice, just to really start to get familiar with initiating them, recognizing when it's right to come in? I just from practice myself, I think sometimes the nuance and the skill is knowing when to declare the emergency, because it's you can almost have this in a Dunning-Kruger effect. You can feel, yeah, I'm confident. Actually, no, I'm not, and this is actually going wrong. But I don't want to say anything to scare the team. But actually, that's my pride and my self-confidence shouldn't be the reason we shouldn't alert the team to this emergency. So how do we train for these predictable emergencies, and then bring out the best in us?
So I think there's 2 points I'd like to make there in response to that. One is talking about how we do simulate, and then the other point is probably a weakness in the model when we're actually dealing in human medicine and not flying aircraft. That maybe the emergencies aren't binary and they aren't obvious, and certainly in the early stages. So you in simulation, what you don't want is you don't want to set up a 20-minute simulation. Say it was a complication of an emergency anesthetic. You don't want to spend the first 15 minutes of that drawing up your drugs and assessing the patient, and then at the end have your complication. I would argue that you have a much shorter simulation that starts maybe just a couple of minutes before the emergency occurs. in order that you focus the learning on how to react to how to detect the emergency, how to communicate with the team, and how you're going to solve the problem. But and you're not, for want of a better term, wasting the time, and that allows you to repeat it if you've got a short simulation that's focused on the reaction to that emergency. What I would say though is, picking up on the point that you made there are probably certain things in aviation, and I use that example there, that are pretty obvious. So the captain of the aircraft will get a warning that there's a battery failure, and that's quite a binary decision, and there are set pieces to way to react to that. Life isn't really like that in medicine. In certain things, definitely a failed intubation during an emergency anaesthetic is initially quite binary. But a patient becoming hypertensive, becoming hypoxic, then that could be a gradual process, which maybe you don't recognise initially. Maybe there isn't a need to start to act immediately in the early stages of that. And yeah, so this idea of the predictable emergencies applies well to certain types of emergencies, but if it's a bit more grey, then it doesn't apply as well.
So, Steve, I wonder if we could look at unpredictable emergencies for a second. And so, if you say that this is where the complications and situations occur that we can't otherwise foresee within practice, and that they require analytical processing to aid decision making and task completion, could you maybe unpack this a little bit further for listeners?
Oh yeah, so what we've been talking about so far are decisions and tasks that are predictable, that you or your colleagues have previously experienced, that we can have ideally standardized approaches to. And we might have cognitive aids. It's stuff that we can drill, we can simulate. But we've all also been in situations where you'll come back to the ambulance station, you'll come back to the retrieval base, and you'll go, you would never believe what actually happened there. And you come up with a story that again, by definition, no one can predict. We've got a video of a paramedic and a doctor with a emergency anesthesia equipment bundle running down the road away from a flock of sheep. So they're just about to anesthetize someone, and a farmer opened the gate and a flock of sheep come down the road. I was running a course, and a paramedic in London was telling me that they were looking after someone that had been stabbed in a house, and it turned out the assailant was actually in the next room. The types of thing, maybe you're at a 1-under and actually the trains haven't stopped, that type of thing. So situations or occurrences which really up the pressure, that you really need to be using that analytical condition. You need to be using the power of the room, as Dan DeWorkes talks about, to problem solve in order to overcome that problem. And what my theory is with this model is that what you're trying to do with everything else that is predictable is trying to preserve that cognitive capacity, that bandwidth for the analytical cognition that you require to problem solve and to communicate and work with the team. Yeah.
So just looking at how we mitigate these states, or indeed this state, how would you indeed train for this state, Steve? What would you advocate for?
Okay, so I see simulation as a tool for exactly this type of thing. I feel simulation should focus less on the technical skills. Those to me should be drilled. But simulation for me should be, thinking about cooperative teamwork, the specific communication under pressure tools, definitely practicing rally points to achieve a shared and accurate mental model, to use the power of the room for suggestions for action, and then to delegate to cognitively offload. So definitely simulating, but specifically giving people awareness of why communication is difficult in high pressure situations, give them specific tools, and definitely teach them about how to undertake and definitely how to lead a rally point, to use the knowledge, the experience, the opinion of people that are there, because so that's what you want to do. That's what you want to do, and you want to teach them those skills, and then you want to simulate.
Listen, that's fantastic. I completely agree. And I think there's a real adage as well in recording simulations so people can watch back and sort of start to see how they've used the utilization, and indeed where they haven't utilized the tools, and how they can adapt and improve on the basis. Because a funny thing about, and maybe you could speak to this about simulation, and especially simulation in this state, so in the state of unpredictable emergencies, where it's entirely cognitive, it's entirely analytical and purposeful, is the state of overwhelm is quite high. So therefore there's so much which the rational and aware brain is missing from the wider scene, because you're so purposeful on the emergency action drill, or indeed on the communication tool, and indeed on the mitigation strategy. There's so much to cleave from the wider scene in these simulations. Could you maybe speak to the adage of training in this state? Because to me it sounds like there's so much to learn, and that the learner might miss in this state that they can improve on.
Okay, so I quite a lot there I'd like to talk about. Number one is, I think we should, on the whole, try and simulate to the state of high performance flow. So we should put people under pressure, but to get them into a positive state of high performance flow. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Is people find that enjoyable. And they'll actually lay down better long-term memories. And they also will, it goes into their part of the long-term memory called their conditioning memory, so that when they're asked to do simulation again, they'll react to it positively. And if they actually come across that clinical situation operationally, then they are going to respond more quickly and more positively. If we simulate to the zone of frazzle, where we deliberately put too much pressure on people, number one, it's embarrassing for them, it's unpleasant for them, and we've got a protective response where we do not lay down long-term memories very well when we're stressed. It's partly to protect us from PTSD. So people don't actually learn that well with that. And also, what my theory is that if you set up a simulation where it's unpleasant for people and they don't perform well, when they face that situation in real life, their conditioning memory will associate it with that simulation, and that's not going to be positive. And there's a lot of chat on social media about stress inoculation. If you do that, you need to be pretty careful and well planned in what you do. So you need to let people know that you are going to simulate, you're going to put so much pressure on them that they are going to perform suboptimally. They are going to move into that zone of frazzle and even freezing. But you need to do exactly what you described earlier on. You need to film that, and you need to stop it and say, right, how did you feel there? How did you know that you're experiencing too much pressure? You need to say to the paramedic, doctor, or nurse that's with them, what did you see? What cues did you receive that told you that person was getting to frazzle? And then what you need to do is give them some tools to manage the pressure, of which there are many. And then you put them back into simulation again. Ideally, they recognize it themselves. They recognize it in their partners, and then they start to use some of those tools. So there needs to be an end game to it. Just this idea of stress inoculation, we'll just simulate until it's all too much pressure and it's all unpleasant, and then we'll just leave it at that. And when those clinicians are faced with a high pressure situation, they'll somehow become immune to it. That doesn't stack up for me. So I'm on a bit of a high horse about that. And there was another part to what you were saying there. Yeah, it's about. I think we need to give people specific tools. When you become focused on a high pressure situation, you've got a cognitive appraisal of threat, or you are looking at a checklist or carrying out a practical procedure. You, again, through evolution, you lose your ability to hear and you lose your peripheral vision. So your situational awareness is lost, and you're reliant. Or also what's happened is that limited cognitive capacity, that working memory, starts being filled up with catastrophizing, regret about how you got yourself into this situation, and it just shrinks further. So what you really need is, you need to be using the eyes and the ears and the brains of other people that are around you, part of your own team, part of the wider Flash team, and you really need to make those people feel empowered to speak up and to contribute and to act positively. So we really want to avoid getting into an expert halo effect or the command gradient, because you'll just stop people thinking and make them think that you've got this nailed when you haven't. And the worst thing that we can do, and it's something that I'm really bad at, is be rude to people, either implicitly or explicitly, because you will just shut them down, their willingness to contribute, and actually you will shrink their cognitive capacity. And that could be a paramedic that you've never met before, who can actually see what's happening and needs to be done. They perceive you as being rude, and they're not going to contribute anymore. So, yeah.
So as we come into land, I fundamentally agree with that, Steve. I think, like you said, there's a chance to either grow as a team or become far more disparate and dysfunctional as a team in these situations. And I think you're right. Bringing the team in and along with you is absolutely vital in this third stage, because I think these can be quite rare events, but the chance to make or break the rapport and indeed the synergy as a team is absolutely key in these events. And you're right, you need the team on side, because it doesn't rise and fall on your skill and indeed your ability. It rises and falls on the team, and so that's absolutely key. Just as we come into land, actually, Steve, on the episode, could you maybe just speak to a few take-home messages for listeners, because there's some fantastic stuff there actually around, and actually what you've described within the episode is almost everybody's day, really, because 90 to 95% of everybody's day is predictable routine, intermingled with maybe 2 to 3% of predictable emergencies, which might be little bit less, little bit more, and then there is that smattering of unpredictable emergencies in there, which is maybe the 2 to 3%. But what you've just described is most people's clinical days, and so I think there's a lot of people can relate to what you've just said. Could you maybe speak to a few take-home messages that people could sort of leave with?
What I would ask people to do is give skills drilling a try, and give mental rehearsal a try as well. On my website, there's a couple of infographics there that talk through how to do that, how to drill and how to mentally rehearse. And what you're trying to do there is develop that automaticity. It's being aware of how we make decisions, how limited our cognitive capacity is, and how we use our long-term memory. And what we're trying to do is just free up that cognitive capacity for the analytical cognition that's required for things that happen to us on scene that are not foreseen and are unpredictable. So absolutely simulate, but maybe use simulation to work specifically on those non-technical skills, but give drilling and mental rehearsal a try as well. I would really recommend that.
Steve, that's fantastic. What we'll do is we'll signpost in the show notes to Core Cognition, which indeed is your company, where you can find these tools and indeed infographics. Certainly where I found more of your work. We've known each other for a long time, but this performance pizza was absolutely fantastic, and there's lots of other tools there. So what we'll do is signpost in the show notes to Core Cognition, and people can just link in there, find these tools, find more information on exactly what you've spoken about in the episode, and find some fantastic infographics about dealing with these 3 states and 3 domains. But so I just want to say thank you for the last 45 minutes, Steve. It's been fantastic just to reconnect and indeed just to get your perspective on these states. And I just want to advocate as well for the content that you're putting out, because I fundamentally think it's a necessary step in training and indeed in reflection in these states. So thank you for that, Steve.
Oh, no, listen, good to speak to you again, and thanks for the invitation. I actually really enjoyed that. Thank you.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.